Welcome everybody. We got the first talk for the basement today. It's from Tarek Habib, it's from KPMG, and it's called Modern IT Disaster Recovery. I want to tell you his resume to add those slides. I don't want to delay it any further, but I do have one thing I want to tell about him. That is, he doesn't like to tell people that took a pandemic to get him to learn how to ride a bike. So, and that was at the age of 30. So it was just that. Thank you. Let's talk now.
Okay, so yeah, it was an interesting experience because I've never done bike before. Wasn't as big a deal in like a major city. Still, that was interesting. Can everyone be okay with the volume?
Good. You can turn it up.
How about now? Can you hear me well?
A little bit better, yeah.
Okay, how about now? Okay, I can hear it. Good at the back?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay. So welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about modern approaches to IT disaster recovery. So we're not talking about the natural disaster version. I'm not really sure where we decided to call IT disruptions disasters, but that's the term that caught on. So we'll be talking about IT disasters. My name is Tarek Habib. I'm a senior manager in the cybersecurity and resilience practice in KPMG in Halifax. My focus is on business resilience, cybersecurity, which includes IT disaster recovery, helping audit those programs, repair those programs, and then design strategies on how we work and how we think about to recover, especially in the age of cyber attacks. That's going to be part of it. That's a big part of the focus that we have today. I know it's a security conference. I did put it through our report there. I promise it goes to my not some other random page. I'll bring it back up at the very end so that we can connect. The very first thing that I wanted to put out there, the disclaimer, is DR, IT disaster recovery, is a team effort. So I'm not an expert on every single piece of DR, especially like cloud architectures, backup solutions. It really takes a team effort. You got IT people that understand their systems and how their systems work. You have the bag of bolts. If there's a cloud component, you need the cloud architect. And then you need someone to bring it all together and do the planning, the communication. And so it is a team effort. You won't find a single person that knows how to do all of those things that can stand up a DR program on their own. So that's just the disclaimer that I wanted to put out there. And I'm the person that basically glues all these things together, all these different professionals and skill sets together to implement the DR program. And I say DR program capability, recovery capability, it's the same thing. I wanted to start off by talking about the current challenge, the problem with DR today and where we stand. The very first thing that I wanted to get out of the way is the difference between business continuity and DR. Like I said before, like DR, I know it in terms of like disaster, and that's what we're really talking about, like technology disasters. So not necessarily, floods and rescuing people from floods. They actually call that emergency management, emergency response. So go figure. But I wanted to call it the difference between business continuity, which is the side that the business has to take care of, where, the business folks have to figure out how to manually survive without any system while the disaster recovery efforts take place. And we have the concept of two safety nets, where the very first safety net is that manual mode, where the business has to operate manually until you recover those systems. And then that remote mode, in parallel, the IT folks are working on building back those systems so that the business operation folks don't just sit around and wait for them. You need multiple safety nets, especially as new types of disruptions come up, especially as you encounter issues with one of those safety nets. You have to have at least those that are working. There are a few different scenarios. So a lot of the times I see disaster recovery programs, they're planning with one specific scenario in mind. A single data center is impacted, 2 data centers are impacted, but there are more different scenarios, more types of disruption that you have to think about. The common two ones that most people talk about are a single site. So, my main data center, my backup data center, they caught fire, everything's gone. Or both sites are impacted, whether it's probably like a cyber attack, or if they're close together, it's a natural weather event that basically are destroying 45% of the people from the data centers. Those are the most common two, but there are more. There's communications only outages. So, my data center is running fine, especially in rural places. Or if you don't have your network connectivity, you don't have access to those systems. How do you recover that? There needs to be consideration for that. There's also the what we call the user workstations, so out desktops, all the technologies that users have. We've seen a rise in cyber attacks and ransomware. In the early days of ransomware, it focused on those end user laptops. Then it shifted to organizational assets, and now we're seeing it happen more. Where some of the targets, part of the target in cyber attacks is on end user workstation, and there has to be a DR protocol on how do we recover those laptops once they're dead. Then there's the third-party disruptions. So there's a scenario where, sometimes it gets ignored, in the contract that they covered, where a third party is actually facing an IT disaster. Not, your systems are fine, your network is fine, but the third party was hit with a disaster. And that's where, I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but there has to be consideration for, especially if your systems are and the pieces together that are glued together between your system and what the third party is fixing, or your operations really integrated with them. There has to be consideration for, well, did I get a test result from that company? Do I understand how fast they can recover? And I'll dig into that at the end. And then the last one is a bit of a combo or an add-on where IT personnel might not be available. So if a disaster happens and the key folks are not available, that's when we have to have the right plans in place and you have to have communication in place to make up for, those people are on vacation. And that delves into, that crosses over into business capability because, the personnel not being available is more of a business capability problem. But when we're talking about DR, those people know how to do very specific technical things. We have to account for that in our planning. Not a single person can be a single point of failure, or it can be a single point of failure, actually. Whenever we have IT disasters, the response and the recovery part is not the first thing that takes place. So whether it's a fire, whether it's a cyber attack, the very first thing that you do is not the disaster recovery part, it's the damage control. Instead of response, trying to figure out what happened, trying to assess the damage, contain it, whether it's a fire, trying to put it out to make sure that it doesn't have more assets, or it's a cyber attack, you're trying to figure out how deep it goes. And then there's also a step that takes a bit of time, which is digital forensics. So if you're talking about a cyber attack, there's a bit of delay where forensics are happening before you can touch those assets to try to recover them. So right before DR, these things need to happen. And we're not going to dig into that side of it. We're going to focus on what happens after you declare disaster and start trying to recover those systems. But I just wanted to mention this because it's one thing that impacts timelines. And timelines is a very big iteration, which is the biggest thing that the business folks care about. How fast are you going to recover those systems? Yes, and so to answer that, I got a lot of questions from people, clients on, well, okay, you're telling me it may take some time. Can you tell me why it could take longer to recover from that disaster? Like, can we just put the thing, do the thing, and we have our systems back? And I decided it's best to explain this through a diagram. Now, I know we can bring out a slide is actually small, so I'll verbally walk through what's happening here. If you imagine a timeline between where the disruption happened and where the systems are recovered and people or users are good to go, there are a few things that happen depending on the scenario. We have a couple scenarios that it's used for this example. One is just like a physical disruption, it's a fire that burned down my main data center. And the second scenario is a ransomware attack, which caused more delays. It's a more complex situation to try to recover from. The common goal at the end is to recover the systems. So there's a journey that needs to happen. And the steps at the end of that journey are similar, they overlap. But the damage control and the investigation is different depending on the scenario. If we talk about the physical disruption, like let's say the fire scenario, the very first thing that happens is you got to evacuate people, you got to put out the fire, you got to assess the extent of the damage. And then if you don't have, if you just lost those access to that infrastructure, you may not have enough infrastructure ready to go at another site. And so these things cause delay. It takes time to put out the fire, figure out what was impacted, go buy extra hardware or spin that up in a cloud environment, and that takes time. And once you have those assets ready, you have to go grab the backup and put it on those assets. And depending on where you have those backups, the time to download them also could take time. So when you think about these things, these three steps take some time. We're talking about a traditional scenario. Once those backups are, you download the backups, you install them, users have to need a little bit of time to check that those systems have been implemented correctly. And then if there's any data to be re-entered, especially if you have to go back to an older backup, that takes time as well before users are really clear to keep using the system as they would have normally done. And if you think about all these things, these can take days, depending on what you have and how much preparation you have. This could take about that much time. In the cyber attack scenario, the very first thing is, again, trying to do a damage assessment. So, the cyber attack happened. Sometimes business folks say, well, all our systems will be recovered in an hour or two. And that may be true if you have a lot of redundancy in like a fire scenario, but in a cyber attack scenario, that's probably the time that it takes just to figure out what happened, or to get early indication of, what kind of cyber attack was it, how far, how wide, how does it go? It takes time to isolate the assets that were impacted. Do the forensic investigation. You got to wait for the forensic analyst to get on site or come in to be able to do their analysis. That takes hours. I've seen it take more than a day, especially if you're a data center. If you don't have any local forensics people and you have to fly someone in, that could take a couple of days before they take what they need and they say, sure, now you can wipe it and use this environment. And then trying to figure out how far back can they go to get the good backups. That also takes time. And you may have to do a couple of runs in these recovery as the investigation unfolds. And this can take days and weeks, depending on, again, where you're recovering to, how far back the breach goes. The main message that they need together to, once you have the backups, identify how far back do I go, then, retrieve the backup, it goes back into those similar steps. The reason of showing you all of this is just to show the reasons, the different things that could cause delays when recovering from the disaster. So that's why we typically see differences in terms of, the business thinks you can do it really fast, and it ends up taking a week or two, especially in some of the high-profile cyber attacks that we've seen in the news. The last thing that I wanted to mention, as all of this is happening, the business folks, the people in operations, the customer service, they're not just sitting there. If this takes 2 days, they need to have their manual workarounds. They need to be able to work in parallel while you're doing all these steps and trying to bring back the systems. They need to have a protocol on how do we work manually without some of those systems. So I wanted to shed a bit of a spotlight on what I mean by manual workarounds. The example that I'll use here is I had a client in manufacturing. They had a bunch of different factories, and they all depended on IT systems to tell them what to produce, to tell them, that this product is now in this stage of the manufacturing process. And if the IT system that they depend on from head office is disrupted, they would just stop. They don't know how to track the products, how to label them, ship them, figure out where they need to go, and manage their inventory. And as part of the business continuity side of things, that's when we develop manual workarounds to say, no, you can keep going. There's a way where you can manually report, moving, using raw materials, shipping out a product, doing a bill of lading manually. And so we ended up developing a protocol for them with templates that are printed in a binder in each factory on how to keep the products moving if the IT systems are disrupted. Same thing for if the what we call OT systems are disrupted, the systems that run the machines. For some of them, there are ways where you don't have to wait for a central control system to tell the machine what to do. An operator can go through the buttons and make the product go through. And so there are ways and guidelines that you can document so that those business operations can survive while you're waiting for a system to be recovered. And it's sometimes cheaper to use that manual option than it is to spend millions on duplicating all your IT infrastructure. So I have a question for you. By a show of hands, how many people are really comfortable explaining the difference of a service level agreement, an SLA, and an RTO, recovery time objective, as you can see in like a vendor agreement, for example? The difference. Okay. So from what I've seen over the last 10 years, there's a huge difference, like specifically when we talk about third-party agreements, in the commitment that you get for recovery. You get something that's like an SLA that says, here's the uptime for our systems, it'll be up 99.99% of the time, you'll have this many minutes of downtime per month. The key thing there is that only applies during business as usual. It doesn't apply, it just goes out the window anytime there's a disaster or force majeure, as it would be defined in those contracts. And that's when the second measure, RTO, the recovery time objective, that's when that kicks in. And a lot of some of the contracts I see just don't even have any mention of it. They have an exclusion that says, this force majeure, cyber attacks, natural disasters, and other stuff like acts of war. We're off the hook for our service level if that happens. And you need to negotiate that because stuff like cyber attacks shouldn't necessarily let you off the hook from the recovery time frame. Just saying it's fine if it takes a week, you can't sue me. So this is something like the difference here is the business as usual metric versus the disaster or disruption scenario metric. Just to wrap up where we are today, I asked an AI tool to show me an image of what it thought IT disaster recovery looked like just currently. It's messy. I do agree with this representation of people running all over the place trying to figure out what's connected to what and what to do. There's stress. They're breaking copies at the data center. So this is only the second attempt at generating an image, and was the next one because it is if you don't have a solid game plan, if you don't have a tested DR plan that you're confident in, this is what it kind of would look like. Some of it from behind screen, but this is what it would look like to try to recover those things. So I thought that would give you a bit of that. So I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the solution to the problem. So the problem is there, the delays are there. The very first thing that's the most popular question in the DR topic is immutable backups. And I wanted to just start off by addressing this and talk about what is immutability. The very simplest definition is it's a backup that just can't be changed or deleted. So you can't go in and change the retention time to 0. You can't go in and delete all the backups, which is what cyber attackers try to do. Anytime they try to breach an environment, they try to breach the backup solution first, delete everything, encrypt everything, and you're stuck. Again, I asked AI to show me what an immutable backup, what it thought an immutable backup looked like, and it showed me this futuristic bay of drives with a bunch of security eggs, little alien eggs guarding it or something. It's not quite as secure as that, but the whole concept of immutable backups is splitting the control of those backups. So usually you have to get a third party involved, whether it's self-managed backup that you implement with like Azure Blob Storage, for example. It has an option for immutability. Microsoft can delete the backups. You can't. And the idea there is there's always someone at some point that can mess with your backups. But when you split that control, basically you as an organization, let's say your accounts get compromised, the attackers can't use those accounts to mess with your backups. Now, if the vendor accounts get compromised and the vendor has that level of access into your environment, then that's a different story. And we'll talk about other solutions for that in a minute. But the idea is you hear vendors talking about immutable backups. That's the whole point, is that they'll take the backup, they'll keep it, and if you want to delete it, you gotta call them and go through a whole process where it's more difficult for attackers to implement it, to hit your backup and your primary copy at the same time. There's also the debate of immutable backups, which are typically online and connected, versus offline backups. And the idea of offline backups is putting data on your USB stick and putting it in your pocket. It's very hard to hack into that kind of backup, but it's slower. And there's a case to be made for having both of those things in place. But they are different, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences next week. Or the page. So there's the golden rule of backup and disaster recovery is called the 3-2-1 rule, or it used to be called the 3-2-1 rule. Now there's another 1 and a 0 in the rule. I'll explain why. But it started off with, there are these 3 things that you have to have in place. And then, they looked at it and said, no, we need more to this golden rule. And they added the 1 and 0. The original version is you have to have 3 copies of data. So you have a copy, you have another copy that's on site, in case that means hardware fails. And then you have a third copy that you send off-site somewhere. The 2 is for 2 media types. So let's say there's a particular vulnerability in whatever backup solution you're using. It's harder to hit it, to compromise the backups if it's on 2 different solutions, 2 different types. And that's where you see people taking a backup to some sort of on-premise device and then putting that on the tape in the traditional sense. And then one of those copies has to be off-site in case there's a fire that burns that whole building. The new 1 and the 0 are really talking about having one of those copies completely offline. And that's not your main backup, that's your doomsday kind of backup, where, if your immutable backup vendor gets compromised, this is the one that you go back to. It's going to be older, it's going to be slower to recover from. It's not going to be as real time. But it's the last resort so that you don't have to pay the attackers the ransom, or if you do pay them and they don't, they mess up the decryption, you still have a backup to resort to. And the last one, the zero, is about zero errors. To make sure that you test your backups, not just take them and keep them somewhere, but test the full test the individual system recovery, test the full recovery, and test everything that you're backing up. So not just the system, but license keys and configurations, and test the whole to make sure that you don't have any errors when it's actually comes to use those backups. There are a lot of backup options and decisions to make out there. The very first one is, do we put it in the cloud or do we keep it on our site? And these are decisions that you have to make. So I'm not going to recommend one versus the other because there's always a situation where one is better than the other. If everything that you're hosting is in a cloud environment, it may be easier to have your backups in a cloud environment. But if you need to, if you're in a business where you have to be able to operate locally, if there's an asset communications outage, let's say you're a hospital, a cloud backup might not help you as much. You need to have something that's closer that you can use in a communications outage. The other decision is, well, do we want to manage it or do we want to outsource the management? And these are combinations. So you can have self-managed cloud backups that you can, there's a Veeam solution that you can put your backups onto Azure Blob Storage and make that immutable, and you have to manage it yourself. Or you can outsource to like DR as a service kind of vendors. Same thing with on-premise. You can self-manage that. You can have a company that manages that backup appliance and you don't have access to it. It really depends on the use case that you have. And these are decisions that you have to think about. And then there's online versus offline. Do we get one? Do we get both? There are different advantages. The offline one is much slower, but it's much harder to mess with. The online one is faster. You have to keep in mind the speed of recovery. So if you're doing a cloud backup, when you have a really slow internet connection from where you're trying to download the backups, it may take days, it may take weeks, depending on how many terabytes that you're trying to download. And the other part that I wanted to mention is there's decisions to be made on where to recover to. So having the backup is one thing, but having those servers and the capacity to be able to recover those assets those backups onto is also critical. And then there are some cases where you just can't have spare infrastructure, especially if we're talking about the OT assets, like devices that control machines in a factory. You have to recover onto that same machine. You can't just recover in a cloud environment or somewhere else in some cases. So there are all these decisions that you have to make, all these scenarios that you have to plan for to have, let's say, a complete or comprehensive DR program. And then that can take a while. For you to implement the DR program, some of the DR roadmaps that we do are 1, 2, sometimes 3 years. It's a very complex environment. But the cyber attacks, the disruption, they can happen tomorrow. And that's where the concept of band-aid solutions come in. Just things that, there are a lot of examples, but I just have to be here for you today. These are things that you do in the meantime while you're waiting for the new shiny ERP tools to be implemented. There's one that I have an example of hardening your backup environment, where you still have maybe a little backup or offline backup, for example. We had a client that invested in a backup tool that they're running in a separate site that they had, and they just didn't have any, management support and financial support to be able to change the backup solution because they just invested in it. So the solution there was to do extra paranoid monitoring, extra hardening, extra safeguards on that backup appliance, so that yes, it's connected and they're exposed, but it's to basically extra protection for that one really critical backup system, because that's all they had access to at that time. There's the more low-cost approach where you're backing things up with hard drives. This works for small businesses. I know a lot of like clinics and restaurants. They do hard drive backups and they swap hard drives every couple of days. It works for a small business. Maybe they don't have much traffic going on, or as many transactions going through that they have to back up, and it works for them as a low-cost option. And then there's just manual mode. If we're talking about OT assets, there's manual way. That's a lower cost way. You still have to use the people time, which is the most expensive piece to prepare for manual overrides to actually operate equipment manually. But it's a band-aid measure that you can put in place just in the meantime. And in terms of the backup solution, so I don't want to put any logos or give any preferences here. There are a lot of solutions out there, and they do different things. There are solutions that are focused specifically on Office 365 backup. There are solutions specifically for mainframes and different types of operating systems. When you're selecting a backup solution, and the very first decision is, do we want to manage it, or do we need a third party to help us with it? And there are a lot of what we call like DR as a service kind of vendors Some of the cloud providers have it, like Microsoft has Azure Site Recovery as a service, but it doesn't do all operating systems that are out there. So it really depends on what you're trying to back up and what features that vendor has. I know there are other vendors that will give you both, like an on-site appliance for quick recovery and their own, a backup in their own data center that's more immutable and can't be touched, can't be hit with the same fire. So they give you both solutions in the same offering. And in terms of what you should be backing up, so a lot of the times I see people focusing on, well, I got to back up my server, so it's all virtualized. I take virtual machine snapshots. But there's a lot more, and sorry for the long list here, but there's a lot more that should be backed up. On the administrative side, we need phone numbers, we need vendor support contracts, we need some of that documentation, the VR plan itself. We need phone numbers for our people. What's our emergency procurement protocol? That kind of stuff. In terms of like more documentation, it's not enough to just have the VR plan. You need a lot of IT documentation, whether it's network diagrams, whether it's like license keys for operating systems, depending on how the recovery works. And then there's the actual technical pieces where, yes, you are taking backups of servers and databases, but that's not the only thing. You have to have a way to recover laptop images. You have to have configuration files for, if I have to rebuild my firewall, if I have to rebuild some networking devices. And so that's not the only thing that has to be backed up. Even SaaS applications, sometimes, a lot of times, they don't come with their own capability. The two examples that I have here is, one is Salesforce. So I know, recently discovered a couple years ago that if there's disruption, you may lose your user data. So you have to either pay Salesforce for an extra piece or back up your own user data and then recover it if something happens. It's a cloud application, but there's a thing in there that you have to back up. The other example I use is Office 365. There are also many backup solutions out there. Microsoft will help you with like some fault tolerance, if there's small errors. But if there's something where someone goes in messaging with your environment, you have to have your own backups for that. It's nice to take a lot of backups, but there's the concept of cost and your actionableness. This is where the recovery point objective comes in. So we talked about time frames before. The RPO recovery point is how far back do I go in the data and how frequently do I back it up? And the normal question here where you're trying to get that requirement is how much data loss can you tolerate? And it could be an hour, it could be zero if you're on like an online banking system, it could be a day. And the two things that you have to decide here is how frequently do I want to be taking backups? Every minute, every hour, every day or week, depending on how fast the system and the data moves. And then how many of those backups do I want to keep? And that's the restore points. Do I want to keep every backup every minute? Do I want to just keep every daily backup for a week, every weekly backup for a month? How far back do I go? Maybe 3 years in backups. Before that, it's not really as useful to recover 20-year-old data unless you have to archive a lot of stuff and keep it in like cold storage. And the key thing here is it's nice to have more restore points, but the cost sometimes is a big factor. So keeping more copies of that data and more frequent snapshots can get very expensive very quickly. So you have to decide, what are the best restore points? How far back could I need to go? Some cyber attacks begin, they work in your environment for 6 months, they start messing around with it, and they execute the big noisy attack. But you may have to, in extreme circumstances, go back 6 months, a year, or at least have access to some of that data to be able to check something. So you may have to keep a year or two of that and determine how many copies, how much frequency they want to keep at the optimal cost. There's also the concept of automation. The easy answer here is automate the backup, but it's not always possible. There are some devices that just have to manually do the backup, especially if it's like a configuration or a firmware that you have to keep a copy of. The VR plan itself, whenever you update it, take an offline copy, put it on a USB stick, for example, or some cloud storage. Some things still have to be backed up manually. Automate the other part where automation comes in is in the backups. So you'll see in a lot of the backup tools and the VR service offerings is they will do a test where, let's say once a week, once a day, they take a backup and they'll run it in their own environment to say, and they'll give you a screenshot of that login page to say, look, the system turned off. It's not a full test because you still have to make sure that users can go in and the application still works and all the dependencies work. But it's just a quick test to say, hey, the backup, it can run. But it's good out there. all of this sounds pretty expensive. So right up front, the negotiation with the business folks on what's our appetite, and are we leaning more towards doing things manually or towards investing in very modern and strong backup and recovery solutions. And it's helpful to have this discussion at the very beginning because you can go down the path and create this awesome DR strategy and architecture, and if they don't want to pay for any of those things, you just wasted some time. If you're better off spending that effort on manual workarounds, because that's their preference, you have to know that. But they also have to understand what your capability is. A lot of the times I see in some IT departments, they have a conversation with the management team and they say, yeah, 24 hours will be that. But they don't have that conversation on what it's going to cost to achieve that. Or if the test results say 3 days, then they're going to have to invest some more in different things, whether it's training, hosting capacity to be able to achieve those timeframes. You can give them some timeframes like, tier 1 slice of your applications, 24 hours, tier 2, this many hours. It doesn't matter what the tiers are, as long as it's agreed with the business and they understand how much they have to invest to get there. So if they say, no, I don't have any budget for this year, you're going to have to tell them, okay, based on the current capability, if you don't want to invest anymore, you can be down for a week. If it's a cyber attack, you can be down for 5 minutes if it's something pretty simple. But if it's the worst case scenario, cyber attack, major fire, you can be down for a week. And that way you inform them of the risk of that decision that they can, and then they can decide. The way to formally analyze this and put some numbers towards it is through a BIA, a business impact analysis. And this is where you grab every business process and you say, okay, going back to the manufacturing example, starting from the end of the process, if you can't ship products, how bad is that for 1 day, 2 days, 7 hours, whatever it is? And how bad is it over time? Then you go back to inventory management, production planning, all of those different steps, and you say, okay, if the systems supporting that process are gone, or that process just can't run at all, how bad is that for your business? How expensive is it for your business? And that helps you justify the investment, either in manual workarounds or modern DR solutions, or a combination of both. I mentioned we'll talk a little bit about third parties. So we talked about the contract gotcha moment and some of the hosted systems. The solution there is to, first of all, treat it like a partnership. So nobody wants to just slap with a contract definition. It starts off with you should have these commitments in contracts, but a lot of contracts already exist, and you can only make these changes when you're using a contract or getting a new contract. So you have to go through governance channels to get at least like a soft commitment to say, we'll do a test using like a major cyber attack scenario, give you the test results, we'll give you at least a handshake commitment, or we'll just tell you what your capability is. So if you get a test result and you thought it was recovery in 4 hours, but the test said it took us a day or 2 days, that helps you understand how much you can expect from that vendor if it was a cyber attack. We have seen vendors, I just checked the news, we've seen vendors that are down for a week, and or more, whether it's healthcare or different industry, whether it's a building system or any other type of like operational system, it could be down for a while. And so you have to understand what those third parties can deliver, and then eventually you get it in the contract. And then the last part is there should be joint exercises where there's a huge codependency. I'll give you an example, or 2 examples. There's one where, let's say the third party is hosting a key system for you, but it's very integrated with your systems. And if they experience a disaster and they implement, in a different site, different location, you still have some things to do on your side to hook it up to that new recovery environment that they have. Depending on if there's changes in networking, changes in things like that, the way users access the system. So at some point, you need to have a joint exercise where they run their disaster recovery test, and then you try to connect to that to see if your side works. The other example that I'll use is more on the manual workaround side. Is there are some vendors that are like provide you a platform, like the one that I had most recent experience with is like a logistics management platform, and the workaround was that vendor would staff up a call center to manually coordinate those trucking shipments. And then we had to have a way, like on the client side, we had to have a way to work with that call center to coordinate our logistics. And they did a joint exercise to basically test that process, test the paperwork that they would have to be emailing to that vendor instead of using the logistics platform that everyone's comfortable with without any of the automation that it had in there. And so they had to manually, talk about the routes, talk about the rates, and all of that. And so those kinds of joint exercises are very practical, especially if a third party is the one that's hit with the disruption. So a couple of things I just wanted to go through, just as like the remaining thoughts that I wanted to leave you with. Like I said before, it's not an IT only responsibility. It's not just the cyber people that have to worry about this. It's a whole business issue, and that's why it needs to be a team effort. It's a complex issue. DR is messy. It's never clean, especially when you're under attack. And so it's all about being survival mode. And we're not trying to replicate the entire IT environment, the entire business. We're trying to basically do enough to make sure that the business survives and eventually over time can recover their full IT capability. Understanding the appetite for investment, very crucial, so you don't waste any time designing something that nobody has any intention of investing in. Implementing temporary measures, these are the band-aids that you can implement tomorrow. There are a lot more than the 3 that I just mentioned, but think of different things that you can do that would save you if a cyber attack happens tomorrow, if a major fire happens in the data center tomorrow. And then looking outside the box, so not just looking at your own systems in VR, but looking at how it works in the ecosystem, where there are so many third parties that are integrated. Usually it's easier to start with the smaller vendors rather than starting with, hey, Microsoft was down. Start with the smaller players that may have a small, not as strong of a recovery capability, and then work your way up towards the bigger vendors. Well, if Microsoft is down, our communications are very critical to communicate out of band. And so these are the thoughts that I'll leave you with. I'll bring up that innocent QR code again. I promise it goes to LinkedIn if you want to connect afterwards. And I'm open to your questions. And I got a 5-minute warning in the back there, so you got 5 minutes for questions.
I have a question, couple maybe. So going back to the 3-2-1-1-0 strategy that we're talking about, like how would that apply in a cloud-based environment? Because typically in a cloud, there's regions, multi-regions, and then there's availability zones, right? Then there's also media types. So how would this typically apply for workloads or anything that's hosted on a cloud environment?
Yeah, so if you think about the concept of 3 copies, that's why they have those like clusters of availability zones. But then you also have regions. So let's say you're only using like one region, and there's a natural disaster in that area that impacted them. They're not going to bring you up in another region unless you pay for that, and that's an extra subscription. So it really depends on what you're trying to plan for. So if you're, let's say, a local business and you operate, I operate in Nova Scotia, and or let's say Toronto, where the data center is, and there's a major national disaster, and then nobody in my community expects my restaurant to be open during a disaster, then you're kind of off the hook. But if you're operating in multiple jurisdictions, there's an expectation that you're running a hospital network. There's an expectation that you're more resilient. You're running an e-commerce platform. You have to look at those scenarios and say, okay, am I okay having my business taken down by a single major weather event? If not, then I have to pay Microsoft or the cloud vendor to put my stuff in multiple regions because they're getting more copies. That helps you with the copies. They have fault tolerance in one availability zone. You have a backup, and that helps you with a single data center breakdown. But then you have to have the other region or a separate kind of backup that's sufficiently far away so that a single major hurricane or snowstorm can't take them out. Their data centers are pretty resilient, but nothing is invincible. So we'll see where climate change takes us. The other part of your question is having 2 media types.
Right.
The idea behind this is, let's say there's an electromagnetic storm. Let's say there's a type of vulnerability in the backup software. Those are different things that can hurt both copies if they're on the same type of solution or media. And so, if you think about the more, this is the more advanced, let's say that DR needs. Let's say you're a hospital or you're the military. It's not enough to say, sorry, both my backups were in a single piece of software. I don't have my backups anymore. You have to have separate type of team. Whether it's a let's say media might be maybe it's like a separate vendor, a separate vendor solution. It could be tapes, just for long-term storage. It depends on how far back you have to keep your data and the protection requirements there. So, do you get an excuse for losing this type of data versus that data? It really comes into play. In cloud environments, you still have to think about, because they're just, cloud is just a bunch of data centers that one company is running. You still have DR considerations there. They just look different because the way they market it, the availability zones and so on, is not as clear.
Okay, perfect. One more question, if you don't mind. On the third-party disaster recovery options that you were talking about. So again, let's say if my organization is focused on one cloud provider, let's assume it's AWS. So where every cloud provider has their fancy tools and natively available options for disaster recovery. So how would a third-party solution really help out, or what are the advantages and disadvantages choosing between an in-house cloud-based disaster recovery versus a third-party solution here?
Some of the challenges, just to talk about a specific cloud provider, for example, if you build your system natively in their environment, it's very hard to recover it anywhere else.
Right.
The big players are, they have enough footprint, enough investment in security where, it's less likely that the whole capability would be wiped out. I have a ton of clients that just want to use, it's more seamless to use their own tools. But it really depends on, I'll give you a concrete example. I have a client that's in professional services. They have a document management system, not SharePoint.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically have a backup set up where they have a copy of their documents. So they don't get all the features that come with the document management tool, but they have a backup copy where if they needed to access documents while waiting for that vendor to recover their stuff, they could access individual documents, and they had a team of people that had access to them that would hand out documents based on permissions. Because if you only have just a bunch of the documents and not the system that manages the permissions, you need a team to filter through those requests. But it's kind of like a last resort. I need access to those documents to go to court and that kind of stuff. That they needed to have that in place. But at the end of the day, you have to trust some vendors, and I'd rather trust ones that have a good a better track record. So if it's Amazon, if it's a smaller provider, if they have a good track record, you can go with them. It's all about the risk appetite.
Right.
Some risk appetites are just not there yet for cloud. People want to manage and control their own backups, and you can do that as long as you have enough skills on the team to do that better than the providers that are out there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Going once? Awesome. All right. Well, everyone, I appreciate your time and listening to me run through disaster recovery, disaster mode. Thank you, everyone.